Welcome to my 259th video on my work with OO gauge. This video will feature a 3-rail kit-built model of an LMS Patriot class locomotive that I bought on eBay. The usual, a bit of background history, a look at the new model with some necessary servicing and repair, and some running video on my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tabletop. So first, a bit of history. The LMS Patriot class, a slightly complicated story. Seen here is a typical member of the Patriot class in essentially as-built condition. The Patriot class was introduced in 1930, so before William Stanier joined the LMS under the supervision of Sir Henry Fowler as Chief Mechanical Engineer. 3 years earlier, in 1927, Fowler had introduced the Royal Scot class as seen here. The basic concept of the Patriot class was to take the Royal Scot chassis and pair it with a boiler derived from the LNWR Clawton class. Here is a member of the Clawton class fitted with the larger type of boiler used for this class. This same type of boiler was subsequently used for the Patriot class. Because the Patriot locos were essentially slightly less powerful versions of the Royal Scots, they were often known as baby Scots. The build status of the Patriots is rather confusing. 52 members of the class were built, and of these, 42 were classified as rebuilt Clawtons, with only 10 being classified as new builds. However, this was basically a bit of an accounting fiddle. As rebuilds, the costs could be charged to an operating account rather than to capital. The first 2 Patriots to be built were in fact rebuilt from Clawtons, retaining the original driving wheels and various other parts. The remaining 40 nominal rebuilds were really new builds, although each of them was matched with a withdrawn Clawton and given the number of the withdrawn Clawton. Initially, but they were all renumbered in 1934. Some Patriots also retained old Clawton names, although many were given new names, some military, some related to holiday destinations served by the LMS. After 1946, many, but not all, members of the class were rebuilt, with tapered boilers and double chimneys, as in the lower drawing here. However, several members of the class, including the original 2 actually rebuilt from Clawtons, continued in service with British Railways unrebuilt until they were withdrawn. All members of the class, rebuilt and unrebuilt, were withdrawn by 1962 and scrapped with no survivors. There is now underway a project to build a brand new Patriot class locomotive to be named the Unknown Warrior. This loco can be seen here. Details of this project may be found on the LMS Patriot project website. Seen here is the LNWR Clawton class locomotive Lady Godiva. The Patriot class Lady Godiva took its name from this Clawton and was classified as a rebuild of the same. Although, as noted, this would have been basically just for accounting purposes. Here is the Patriot Lady Godiva in LMS service. My new model is named and numbered as Lady Godiva, which is why I'm focusing on this particular loco. Patriot Lady Godiva was completed in 1933, initially taking the number 6008, which was given by the LMS to the Clawton Lady Godiva, and subsequently renumbered as 5519 in 1934. Upon nationalisation in 1948, the locomotive was renumbered 45519, as seen here. It continued in service unrebuilt until it was withdrawn in 1962. So far as I know, the only thing that remains of that loco is the nameplate, seen here. Here's my new model with the box it arrived in. Of course, when it arrived it wasn't loose like this, but packed with tissue paper and packing peanuts. Nevertheless, it suffered some damage in transit. This part fell out when I unpacked the model, and I wasn't initially sure what it was. Given that there were some awkward-looking breakages and that the paintwork of the model wasn't in the best shape, I felt rather doubtful about working on this model, and I kept putting it aside in favour of less discouraging projects. But I figured that I'd really better have a go at it, and I got it onto my workbench. Here's a closer view of the loco together with the loose part. I realised that the loose part represented the bars on which the crosshead should slide on the left side of the loco. You can see the crosshead here mounted on the end of the piston rod coming from the cylinder, and with the drive rod pivoted on it, but with no supporting rails. This kit-built model came with a chassis for 3-rail running, which made it particularly appealing to me. I already had quite good 2-rail examples of the Patriot class, but not one for 3-rail. Here you can see the complete valve gear on the right side of the model, together with the piece broken off from the left side. The corresponding rails on the right side were soldered to the body of the cylinder, as well as being supported by a bracket soldered above. I figured that refitting the rails to the left side was something I was going to find very challenging. I wanted to start by separating the body and the chassis. I would need to get the chassis out for servicing anyway, and if I was going to have any success with repairing the valve gear, it would be easier to get at things with the body removed. There was nothing visibly holding body and chassis together at the front. At the rear there was a single screw fastening the chassis to the body. I undid that screw. The chassis didn't immediately come away from the body, but by pulling the chassis backwards and then pivoting it, I was able to separate body and chassis. Here's the top of the chassis. I don't see any maker's marks on this chassis, so I don't know its origin. It's fitted with something like an X04 motor, and there are no flanges on the centre driving wheels. Here's the area around the cylinders, with the damaged valve gear on the bottom side. I undid the screw holding on the front bogie and removed that bogie. This is the side with the complete valve gear. The motor didn't have a screw in the usual position for retaining the back, although the bracket for that back retaining screw was still present. Instead, the brass screw holding on the brush spring and going through the magnet was long enough to screw into the chassis below the magnet, holding the back of the motor in place. However, when I undid that screw enough to allow the back of the motor to be lifted, I still couldn't get the motor out. It seemed to be held in place by some sort of bracket at the front, and I couldn't see what was holding that bracket in place. I tried to fit the rails for the crosshead on the left-hand side back into place without very much success. I used CA glue rather than soldering. I cleaned the wheels using a bronze brush in a rotary tool. The motor did operate with power from my bench power supply, allowing me to clean the wheels all the way round. I unclipped the arms of the brush springs from the brushes and then removed the brushes to allow me to get at the commutator. I got out some T-cut to clean the commutator. The commutator was particularly filthy. I went through around half a dozen cotton buds removing black filth from it before the buds actually came away clean. You can see here that the back of the motor is lifted away from the chassis, but the front is still held in place. I cleaned the brushes and refitted them, fitting the ends of the spring arms back in place and trapping the contact on the end of the wire from the centre rail pickup between the brush and the insulating sleeve on that arm of the spring. I checked the running of the motor again with my bench power supply.
So, an initial running trial for this kit-built Patriot chassis. That's nearly 80% on the gauge master controller. We can turn it down a little from that, I guess. It's more like 70% on the gauge master controller. He's a bit stuttery over the points. Don't know whether that's the centre. I can turn it down from that. He hardly gets over that point, and I cleaned that point as well, because he was having trouble getting over it. Actually, he's getting over that point fine, but somehow or other when he hits that point he really stutters. I would suspect the centre rail pickup, but it could be the wheels. Could be the wheels. It may not be the centre rail pickup, but I think the centre rail pickup's weaker. Let's try him in the other direction. Just about managed. That's only just over 60% now on the gauge master going backwards. When he got stuck in the tunnel, I could probably persuade him to move, but I mean, it's just a bit of a connection problem, I'm pretty sure. Go on. Yes. See, where is he? Bit more speed. See if I can get him back through the tunnel this time. Yeah, okay, well that'll do for now. It may be a bit dirty under the tunnel there, but... Okay, so basically he's running, although maybe a bit of a contact problem over points here and there.
I cleaned the wheels of the front bogie. These were also quite filthy. I believe this model has seen a lot of running in its time. I oiled all of the axles and other pivot points and also applied some grease to the worm and drive gear. I refitted the front bogie. The left side of the cab was somewhat damaged, the steps bent and the rail broken off at one end. I did my best to repair that damage using CA glue. I got the chassis back fitted into the body. The tender had a wire hook on the front of it, but nothing had been done about providing something on the back of the loco for the tender to hook onto. I cut a piece of brass sheet to about the right size. I figured that the body retaining screw could hold my piece of brass in place so long as I cut it narrow enough to fit between the frames. I drilled a hole in my brass piece large enough for the body retaining screw to fit through. I drilled a small hole in the back end of my brass piece and rounded off that end so that it would allow the tender to pivot. Then I removed the body retaining screw, fitted my brass piece between the body and the chassis, and did the screw up again. This allowed me to couple the tender to the loco. I painted the protruding section of my brass piece with flat black paint so that it would be less obvious. The piece from the valve gear came off again at this point. I tried to fit it again, but I couldn't really get it right. However, the valve gear did still seem able to operate without fouling. At this point I felt about ready to give loco and tender a run together. I got the model onto my 3-rail tracks.
So here's this kit-built 3-rail Patriot, Lady Godiva, after what I guess you could call a first round of attempting repairs and servicing. I've tried to put that piece of the valve gear back on twice, because it fell off the first time, and then, quite honestly, it'll perhaps just fall off again. I don't think I can solder it in place where it needs to go, and I'm trying to glue it with super glue, and it doesn't go on very well. It's very iffy, trying to repair the valve gear like that. We'll see. If it does fall off, if I can't get it to go on at all, maybe I can just get the thing to operate without that. I think the valve gear will more or less work without that. Of course, it doesn't look right. Oh well, and we've hooked the tender up now. There's no coal load in the tender. It would be nice to, I should put a coal load in the tender at least. And the paintwork's kind of iffy. I probably should try and do something about the paintwork, but let's see how it'll go now if we can. Famous last words. It's a bit hesitant. The pickup's not terrific. I did clean. I used electrical contact. I think something derailed there. Yeah. The bogie had come off the rails there. Now whether it came off as it went over the point or whether I never got it on right in the first place, I don't entirely know. And of course there's a bit of dirt there in the blasted. There's a bit of dirty track under the tunnel there. I gotta lift the tunnel. Ooh. I need to lift the tunnel and clean under the tunnel because there's a bit of dirty track there, and also I think we hit the tunnel there anyway. Well, that's a couple times round without derailing. I don't think I'm going to push it any further than that at this point.
I wanted to at least fit a coal load into the tender. I decided to leave painting issues aside for the time being, except for a little touching up of the black here and there, where brass was obviously showing. I cut a piece of sponge on an angle to fit into the bottom of the tender coal hopper. I painted the top of that piece of sponge with flat black. Once the paint dried, I fitted the sponge piece into the tender. I got out some Woodland Scenics coal. I spooned some of that coal into the tender on top of the sponge piece. Next, I dripped rubbing alcohol onto the coal to wet it so that glue would run down into the coal rather than sitting on the surface. And then I dripped a generous quantity of watered-down white glue into the coal. This thoroughly soaked everything and hopefully should hold the coal in place once it dries. And here is the tender after the glue dried. I got the model back onto my 3-rail tracks. I coupled the loco up with an articulated set of crimson coaches for some running.
So there we go, there's that Patriot, and it's pulling the sort of set of 3 articulated crimson coaches that I kind of put together. Well, I bought 2 that someone had put together, and then I added a 3rd. Ooh. For some reason, we're still almost stopping as we go under the tunnel there. I don't know what the problem is there. I've cleaned that track under that tunnel really aggressively, but I can't seem to make it work any better. But anyway, there we go. I think for now that'll do for this kit-built 3-rail Patriot. I could do with touching up the paintwork, but I don't know whether I'm going to, not right this minute anyway.